Hello, everyone. Welcome to a two-part lecture on the ethical issues of the abuse of what is known as RWOPS. The objectives of this lecture are to firstly define and describe dual practice. So you will get an understanding of what dual practice in fact is. The second objective is to describe dual practice in South Africa. And the third and final objective of this lecture is to discuss the ethical issues that are associated with the abuse of what is known as remunerated work outside public service. And this is also known as RWOPS. What is dual practice? Dual practice is known or understood to be concomitant practice in two or more distinct clinical services, either in the same or in different healthcare institutions. Now, what this basically means is that a practitioner, a medical practitioner or a health practitioner, can hold multiple jobs either in public sector and or in private sector. So what this definition basically means is that a practitioner will have more than one job, and usually the jobs will be in different institutions. So even though a practitioner may have more than one job, usually a person who would participate in dual practice does have a primary or full-time job. So a primary job can be considered as the job at which the practitioner spends most of their time, where they have legal obligations based on a contract. They may even be part-time employees in a specific institution, but they spend most of their time or working time in that particular institution. The primary job is like a main job. So this is the job that they would attend to on a daily basis, or at least often enough in terms of the amount of time they spend in that particular facility. Then a person who engages in dual practice would then have a secondary job. A secondary job could also be periodic work or part-time work. So for example, if someone is full-time employed at, say, Charlotte Maxeke Johannesburg Academic Hospital, they may take a secondary job to work at a private institution and see patients there from time to time. Or they can have a secondary job where even if they see patients from time to time at a private facility, it's in periods. So, for example, every once in a while they're called in to see a number of patients based on their expertise. So, basically, think of the secondary job as like a side hustle, right? So, it's not the main job, and they effectively would be in this place of work as a secondary job, and they would be spending less time in that place of work. When I say that they should be spending less time at their place of work, I do want to clarify. This would be based on contractual agreements. So the primary job would be where they have more responsibilities in terms of time and presence. Secondary job means they're supposed to spend less time in that particular environment and do perhaps less work as well in that environment in terms of taking number of patients and so on. So there's something called casual work, and this is called casualization of work, which occurs when there is no clear job security. So this would be like a practitioner who, for example, is registered with an agency, such as nursing agencies, and they work at different places at different times, and they almost have an erratic schedule that is dependent on availability of jobs. So they don't necessarily have a primary and secondary job. They just effectively work in different and multiple health institutions at the same time. So dual practice is basically multiple job holding, and it's also known as moonlighting. And I think you guys may be familiar with the term moonlighting. Now, multiple job holding has benefits, and of course, there are definitely consequences to multiple job holding, which we'll venture into now. I do want to emphasize that there is a difference between overtime and dual practice. So overtime basically means that if a clinical associate, for example, works at Charlotte Maxeke, and I'm picking on this particular hospital because it's the nearest. Um, so if a clinical associate works in Simja, what would happen is if they are working overtime, if they, for example, work 40 hours a week, overtime would be an extension of the 40 hours. So instead of 40 hours, they work for 50 hours, an extra 10 hours. And that's different from dual practice because, as we've described, dual practice means that you work in another either department, perhaps in the same hospital, or in a different institution entirely, where you have different sets of contracts or different sets of responsibilities. An example of dual practice, as I have probably described briefly, but just to elucidate what I mean is, for example, a practitioner has a full-time job at a public health facility, and then they may have a secondary job at a private facility. This may also include, for example, practitioners who locum in a private general practice. So they may work at a specific public health facility, and then they say it's a locum. So basically, you go in from time to time, depending on the need, to assist at a general practice. So in South Africa, the term dual practice, so think of it this way, dual practice is basically the official concept or terminology according to the literature. And then in South Africa specifically, what we have is remunerated work outside of public service. So we refer to dual practice as RWOPS. And this is because there's a specific policy that talks about remunerated work or paid work outside of public service. And there's specification in terms of how this is allowable, and this is how we refer to it in South Africa. It's called RWOPS. RWOPS is quite common in South Africa. Literature has shown that at different times, up to approximately 28% of nurses have been involved in dual practice. Interestingly, in research, you find that a lot of studies focus on nurses for two reasons. The first is that nurses are usually the bulk of health professionals in terms of human resources. And secondly, nurses are obviously in high demand, both in private and public sectors. So there's quite a big focus on nurses in the literature. However, I do want to say that dual practice is not limited to a specific professional or specific health professional. Nurses, clinical associates, doctors, all levels of doctors can be involved in dual practice, and other types of public service workers can be involved in remunerated work outside of public service. So the RWOPS policy itself is not limited to health professionals, but it's definitely applicable to health professionals, and that is why it has become quite topical in the past and even in the present literature. Okay, so why do practitioners engage in dual practice? The first reason is that having multiple jobs is a way to increase your income. So there are professionals, health professionals in particular, that don't particularly earn a lot. And so what they would choose to do is to work in other institutions to have a secondary source of income, and to have obviously personal development in terms of their finances. The second reason is flexibility, and this specifically works for people who do casual work, so people who would be in nursing agencies and other types of professional agencies where they want to balance their lives with other things. So, for example, a working mom or a person who would prefer to be a stay-at-home dad, but wants to be involved in some kind of professional work. So what they would do is they would have a flexible schedule where they block out times where they're available to do casual work and times where they're not available to do casual work. The other benefit of engaging in dual practice is that different environments offer a diverse range of experiences and opportunities. So what would happen is the amount of cases and the types of pathologies that a professional would be exposed to will differ because as they engage in different institutions, there are different types of patients with different types of histories and clinical cases. So to some, it is interesting and exciting to diversify their skill set and portfolio in terms of their professional skills. So it's a benefit that they cite as one of the draw cards to dual practice. And then finally, sometimes institutions provide training and additional professional benefits, and so some may engage in dual practice after having identified certain practices or health institutions that have additional professional benefits that their primary job may not have. So now we're going to talk about the abuse of RWOPS or dual practice. Now, I do want to say that the lecture has been entitled The Ethical Issues of the Abuse of RWOPS. It is important to note that as stated, dual practice is allowable. There are benefits to dual practice. However, we want to now look at the abuses of dual practice or RWOPS. And herein lies the problem. So, firstly, when a practitioner does not honor their duties with the public sector or their primary job, therein starts the issue of the abuse of RWOPS. So, RWOPS became a problem when additional work, or at least becomes a problem when additional work starts to affect public service or their primary jobs. Now, some of the ways in which abuse of RWOPS can be identified is that a person who works at their secondary job spends more time at the secondary job than allowable. So obviously you have a set contract with your primary job, you have specified working hours, you have specified working days, and what happens is the secondary job has to effectively conform to the schedules of the primary job. However, what happens is some people find that they spend more time in the secondary job than allowable, which is obviously a breach of the primary job's contract. There has been a phenomenon in the literature that describes that people will take their personal days and even their sick leave to essentially find work in secondary jobs. So what they'll do is they will pretend to be sick at their primary place of work in order for them to go and work at a secondary job. Now, this is obviously not allowed. If, for example, someone takes personal days, you don't have to effectively tell your employer what it is that you will be doing. When you take personal days, it's your personal days, and you can attend to your affairs. However, when you take sick leave, there's an impression that you are unable to work. And usually, sick leave means that you would be paid for that period of time. And so what happens is you won't have any payment deductions at your primary place of work, and you will gain financial gain at your secondary job when you apply for leave. And so this is understood to be an abuse of sick leave because sick leave is not intended for this. And so naturally, what would happen is if people have two or multiple jobs, especially in health professions and clinical settings, they will experience a lot of stress, and this could result in fatigue and thus low morale in health practitioners. And how this trickles down is it affects how the practitioners engage with their patients, how they report to their primary and secondary jobs because they are fatigued. One of the ways you can tell that the abuse of RWOPS is in fact problematic is that there's an issue of patient neglect that has been observed. So, if, for example, someone does not show up for work at all, even if they were meant to, that means that there are patients that won't be attended to because the practitioners working in another facility. Because a practitioner who is overstretched in terms of time and is very fatigued, mistakes can happen. And so medical negligence cases result as a result of abuse of RWOPS. And so obviously this limits or at least diminishes the quality of services that can be rendered by a specific practitioner if they find themselves to be overworked and too committed to different things and in fact conflicted. Now what this raises is obviously a concern in the risk to patients, and this could also result in litigation. So patients are entitled to take the Department of Health to court for any negligence or injury that could be avoidable that was caused at the hospital facility. And this is very important. I mean, besides a legal suit, patients' lives are at stake. If a patient's neglected and something minor turns into a moderate or severe condition, if a patient's life is drastically changed to the extent that parts of their lives are changed, this has implications on the individual's life and also on the Department of Health. And of course, poor quality of services is a serious problem in South Africa, as we've discussed in previous lectures. This would only exacerbate that problem. And it is also important to note that the experience of patients and the satisfaction of patients is important. And so, if you have a practitioner that is overcommitted, extremely fatigued, and stressed because of the multiple roles they play in different institutions, that will affect how they engage with patients and how patients feel in a hospital and clinical setting is absolutely important. So, this abuse of RWOPS could negatively affect patient satisfaction. In the past, there have been a number of cases that are related to remunerated work outside of public service. However, two cases that have been quite big in the literature and also in conversations are in 2004 a report was released and it's pictured here. So this report was basically an investigation on a remunerated work outside public service abuse in Gauteng, and people were interviewed as well as other internal investigations in order to understand the extent to which practitioners abuse RWOPS. This report, even though it was contentious for multiple reasons, did highlight, though, that there are serious issues in the system when it pertains to RWOPS. And the Minister of Health at the time, which was Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, really felt that these Gauteng practitioners who abused RWOPS were abusing the state and effectively abusing patients. And then in 2011, reports on practitioners from Tata came out. And this investigation was interesting because some of the facts, or at least the data from practitioners, was found through medical schemes or medical aids. And they looked into how much certain practitioners were getting from medical aids. And these practitioners also happened to be public servants. So they worked in public institutions. And so it didn't really match up because a lot of the claims that they were making, um, I mean, there was a figure in one of the reports that said that one practitioner had earned just under 800,000 rands in 6 months through the secondary job, which was in the private sector, and this was based on claims. And this was compared to his annual or her annual salary, which was, I think, 1.3 million. So if you can see, a substantial amount of money was being made in the private sector that almost doubled in terms of the amount of money that they earned per annum in public sector. And so there were issues that were raised in that if there's so much money that is being made, whether that money is being made ethically or not is another question. But there's so much money being earned in these secondary jobs that could effectively cause conflicts of interest, which we will discuss in the next part. And it could compromise the public sector because there's this drive that practitioners were money driven in this particular area. And so you can see that the abuse of RWOPS, I mean, in the early 2000s through to after 2010, and even now, remains to be a topical issue, especially when it pertains to the abuse of RWOPS. So what we're going to do now, well, in fact, what we have done is we've gone through just the basics of dual practice and RWOPS, just for your basic understanding. In the next section, we will focus specifically on the ethics and also legal considerations that must be made when considering the abuse of RWOPS.